Joining me now, Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Maryland Democrat and a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Good evening, sir. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us.
Delighted to be with you, Don.
Are you willing to accept the findings of the special counsel that there was no coordination or conspiracy, what's become known as collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia?
Well, as soon as I get to read them, what we need is the complete report turned over to Congress so we can read exactly what the special counsel is saying, and then we want to see the underlying evidence. But I'm willing to accept them exactly for what they are as soon as we get to see them. All we've gotten now is, a few paragraphs of characterization, which seem more and more opaque and inscrutable and vexing when you really look into them. So,
do you think if they were that far off on their summary of what Mueller found that he would be responding to it now?
Well, they look at the question of obstruction of justice, for example, where, according to Attorney General Barr, Mueller said that there was apparently substantial evidence, enough evidence where there could have been an indictment, but on the other hand, he felt that there was also evidence weighing in the other direction. But that evidence, as far as we know, may have just been the special counsel saying, we know that the Department of Justice takes the position that the President of the United States should not be indicted. Or maybe he's simply mirroring back to Attorney General Barr's position that he spelled out in a lengthy memo before he got appointed Attorney General, that the President, by definition, could not be guilty of obstruction of justice when it comes to federal prosecutors because he's their boss and he's got the unitary executive right to tell them to do whatever he wants them to do.
All right, you say that, but let me just read something, okay? When he talked about applying the principles of federal prosecution that guide charging decisions. He said, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and I have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the President committed an obstruction of justice. Our determination was made without regard to and is not based on the constitutional considerations that surround the indictment and criminal prosecution of a sitting president. It seems like they took that into account and said they didn't.
Well, what they took into account was one legal argument. They said, we're going to set aside for the second our doubts about whether or not the Department of Justice should indict the president. But it doesn't deal at all with the completely separate legal theory advanced by Attorney General Barr, which is that the president cannot be guilty of obstructing justice when he interferes in an ongoing law enforcement investigation, including one related to him, because he's their boss. That's a completely different legal theory. And so we shouldn't be confused by that little sleight of hand there in the memo.
So not being able to, the special counsel not being able to come up with some sort of conclusion about obstruction of justice, wasn't that part of their job?
Well, part of whose job?
Part of the special counsel's job.
Yeah, and we don't know what the special counsel said. I mean, the memo might say, we think that there's enough evidence to go forward with a prosecution, but we're going to leave it up to the Department of Justice to decide what to do because we know that there are a lot of legal questions around this. One of those legal questions is the one that's been injected by Attorney General Barr himself in what turns out to be a kind of job application, this memo where he said that the president never can be held for obstruction of justice when he interferes in an ongoing law enforcement investigation because of the unitary executive theory, which just means the president is always the boss and he's in charge of the Department of Justice and all of the lawyers and prosecutors in it. So look, here's the thing. The president is already running around saying that he's received a complete and total exoneration from special counsel Mueller and the Department of Justice. If that's true, nobody should be afraid of following what the Congress in an overwhelming 420-0 vote asked for, which is for the whole report to be made public so we can see what it says. And then everybody can have their victory parades and take their laps and so on. But really, this should not be based on a couple paragraphs of recitation of what the Attorney General thinks the conclusions are of this 2-year investigation.
I know it says that, the special counsel says that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. And then it goes on to say that they're leaving that decision up to the Attorney General to determine whether the conduct described in the report constitutes a crime. So isn't that also, is that part of Congress's job? Is he leaving it up to Congress to decide if that rises to the level of impeachment or what?
Well, in the final analysis, of course, it is Congress that's got to decide about presidential misconduct. But there's another sleight of hand which is taking place in that memo, which is I think that the Attorney General is confusing an apparent statement, although we haven't read it, so we don't know, but an apparent statement by the special counsel that there was not sufficient evidence found to determine that there was conspiracy. He's confusing that with a statement that the special counsel found there was no conspiracy, or there was enough evidence to find there was not a conspiracy. That's very different from finding that there wasn't enough evidence, there wasn't a sufficient quantum of evidence to show it. Obviously, prosecutors are looking for a lot of evidence, enough to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody committed a crime. And if they're being scrupulous about that, there might be a lot of evidence, including enough evidence to convince the ordinary person that something took place, but not enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in court. That's not the standard, of course, that Congress is using. So, look, the bottom line is we shouldn't have to be squinting at this document and trying to read between the lines. All we need is the report that the special counsel produced. It's what the Congress unanimously asked for. It's what the president said he wanted, at least before all of this started. So before everybody starts running 500 victory laps about how everything's fine, let's turn over the report so we can treat this as a serious matter of law enforcement.
Okay.
We'll take it for what it is. We've got to weigh it in context of everything that the special counsel is doing and everything we're doing.
I've got a lot to ask you. If you're lightning round, you can give me a quick one. Do you want Barr to testify? Are you going to call him testify?
I think that Barr has interjected himself in this investigation by making the final call about whether there's obstruction of justice. That was a very opaque and inscrutable statement.
So what are you going to ask him?
So yes, I would like to see him explain exactly how he arrived at that conclusion.
All right. And do you want Mueller to testify?
We want to see the Mueller report. Obviously, we may have questions, but I think we read the Mueller report and then we see whether we need Mueller to testify. Rosenstein, to the extent that he's been implicated in the decision-making process by the Attorney General, maybe should come back again.
Okay. So your committee launched a massive investigation in the Trump administration requesting documents from 81 individuals and entities. In light of Mueller's findings, will the scope of your investigation change now?
Well, remember, some of those investigations, or most of those investigations, have already taken place at other levels of government and other federal investigations or state investigations. So those documents are easily available, and I think tens of thousands of them have already come in. We're hoping that the Mueller report, once we read it, helps us to focus our investigations into things like abuse of the security clearance process. What exactly did take place in terms of the president trying to negotiate a deal with the Russians during the course of the campaign? Was the White House involved in Michael Cohen's false statements to Congress? Did they influence him to make those statements and so on? So we want to get very specific about all of the corruption and lawlessness that have been taking place. Remember, for 2 years in the last Congress, none of this stuff was investigated by the House, and that's why there was this backlog of requests that the committee chairs have sent in.
Congressman Raskin, thank you.